At 6:30 a.m. on the 27th of August, the conference hall in Addis Ababa froze. Hundreds of international journalists leaned forward. Dozens of world leaders sat stunned in their seats. And at the center of the stage stood a young captain from West Africa, Ibrahim Traoré, interim president of Burkina Faso. He was not dressed for theater, no polished suit, no rehearsed gestures, just his uniform, his steady eyes, and a voice that carried more weight than the walls of the African Union could contain. He stared directly into the cameras, and with no hesitation, he declared, "Prime Minister Netanyahu, you have 48 hours to apologize to Africa, or you will no longer be welcome here." The silence that followed was unlike anything modern diplomacy had seen. This was not the language of compromise. It was not a carefully phrased policy speech. It was raw dignity, a demand born from centuries of struggle. And in that silence, the entire world leaned in. What was this man from a small, landlocked country really doing? Was this the dawn of a new African diplomacy? Or the beginning of a dangerous confrontation that could spiral out of control? This moment was more than just a political ultimatum. It was a strike at the heart of an old order. It was Africa telling the world, "We are not pawns. We are not subjects. We are not experiments in your games of power. We are sovereign. We are dignified. And we will no longer bow." Before we journey deeper into this story, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, if you were in that hall, if you heard those words with your own ears, what would you feel? Would you be afraid of the consequences? Or proud that someone finally spoke the truth no one else dared to? If this story already stirs something inside you, I invite you to leave a comment. Tell us what you think about Traoré's stand. And if you want to keep following powerful stories like this, stories of Africa's struggle for dignity and justice, then subscribe to this channel. Not just to follow news, but to join a community that believes in truth, in justice, and in the value of human dignity. This story did not begin in the conference hall on the morning of August 27th. It began days earlier, inside a closed room at the G7 summit. According to multiple diplomatic sources, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made remarks that African leaders found deeply offensive. He allegedly described African heads of state as political opportunists, naive, and theatrically cheap when they criticized Israel's Gaza campaign. Some diplomats later confirmed the language was even harsher, labeling Africa's response as crude, militantly theatrical, and unserious. But it didn't stop with insults. Netanyahu was also said to have hinted at supporting IMF plans to tighten debt collection across Africa, and he floated the idea of creating a new alliance under Western sponsorship, tied to the so-called Great Reconstruction 2030 Pact. That proposal immediately raised fears of a geopolitical restructuring designed to push Africa to the margins once again. When the leak broke into the open, outrage swept across the continent. On Africa News, the story dominated the front page. Within hours, the hashtag #Africa is not your pawn was trending, generating millions of shares across social media. But while the storm raged online, Ibrahim Traoré chose silence. For several days, he said nothing, a silence that many later realized was not hesitation, but strategy. He was not going to respond with anger in the heat of the moment. He was waiting for the right stage, the African Development Summit in Addis Ababa. And when the morning of August 27th came, he walked to the podium with unshakable resolve. No diplomatic sugarcoating, no vague language. He looked straight into the camera and spoke words that cut through the noise. "Prime Minister Netanyahu, Africa will not be your pawn, nor the subject of debt chains or Western experiments. This is not a game of alliances. This is a question of dignity. You have 48 hours to apologize. If not, you will no longer be welcome on this continent, not in trade, not in diplomacy, not in the future of history. The hall went silent. Journalists froze mid-keystroke. Delegates glanced at one another in disbelief. This was not a threat of war. It was not a promise of sanctions. It was something far more powerful, a diplomatic ultimatum of dignity, a direct strike against the imbalance of power that had defined Africa's relationship with the West for decades. From that moment forward, Burkina Faso was no longer just a small, landlocked nation in West Africa. It had become the epicenter of a global conversation about respect, sovereignty, and the future of African diplomacy. And then the clock began to tick. 72 hours, 48 hours, 24 hours. A new diplomatic crisis had been born. This is where the world held its breath. Would Netanyahu bow to the pressure and issue an apology? Or would Israel's silence only drive the tensions higher? And what would that mean for the millions of Africans who saw Traore not just as a leader, but as a symbol of dignity? If you believe Africa's voice must be heard, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Do you see this ultimatum as a turning point, or as a dangerous gamble? And if you want to keep following stories that reveal the truth behind global power struggles, subscribe to this channel. Here, you will find more than headlines. You will find the voices of people and nations fighting for their rightful place in history. The reaction was immediate. Within minutes of Traore's ultimatum, the clip exploded across the internet. From Johannesburg to Lagos, from Dakar to Nairobi, people replayed the moment again and again. On social media, the hashtag #Africa is not your pawn surged to the top of trending lists worldwide. On Africa News, commentators called it a turning point, a shockwave in modern diplomacy. For millions of Africans, it was more than politics. It was a raw declaration of pride. Across the continent, students filled university campuses, chanting Traore's words in unison. In South Africa, the foreign minister reposted the viral clip with a simple caption, "Finally, someone said it." In Kenya, a former UN ambassador wrote, "This is the future of African diplomacy, fearless, incorruptible, unapologetic." In the streets of Ouagadougou, thousands gathered, waving the flag of Burkina Faso and shouting, "Long live Captain Traore." Even in remote villages scarred by insurgency, people repeated the ultimatum around campfires, turning it into a shared story of dignity. In London, Paris, and New York, African diaspora communities rallied. In Harlem, marchers lifted both the flag of the United States and Burkina Faso, side by side. Chants echoed through the streets. Africa stands tall. Africa stands proud. For many, this was not just about Burkina Faso. It was about an entire continent standing up after centuries of dismissal. By contrast, Israel's response was muted. Netanyahu's office issued only a vague statement denying the leaked remarks, without addressing Traore's ultimatum directly. Instead of calming tensions, the silence only inflamed them further. Analysts said it confirmed what many Africans had long suspected, that their concerns were brushed aside, not taken seriously. In Washington, reactions were divided. Some politicians called Traore reckless, warning that such bold defiance might fracture fragile alliances. But others, especially African American scholars and activists, saw something very different. They called it clarity. They called it courage. They called it sovereignty spoken aloud in a world that rarely grants Africa a voice. On college campuses from Howard University to UCLA, student forums sprang up overnight. Young Africans and African Americans gathered to debate the meaning of that moment. They weren't just analyzing policy. They were celebrating the sight of an African leader refusing to bow. In Moscow and Beijing, state media amplified the story relentlessly. They framed Traore as a symbol of resistance against Western dominance, a hero of the global South. Meanwhile, in Brussels and Paris, leaders urged constructive dialogue, their careful words betraying nervousness at how fast the balance of influence in Africa was shifting. Even in the Middle East, opinions split. Some governments warned the ultimatum was provocative. Others quietly admired the boldness of a small African nation forcing a global power onto the defensive. And as hours passed, the momentum only grew. Africa, so often spoken for, was suddenly speaking with one voice. For the first time in years, unity was not a slogan. It was visible, urgent, undeniable. But with unity came risk. Analysts warned, if Netanyahu refused to apologize, expectations could collapse into disappointment. Would the fire of this movement burn brighter, or would it burn out? Ask yourself, is this a fleeting burst of pride, or the beginning of a new order in African diplomacy? If you believe this moment matters, I invite you to share your view in the comments. And if you want to keep following the rise of voices that challenge old powers, subscribe to this channel. Together, we can follow history as it is written in real time. Inside Burkina Faso, the weight of Traoré's ultimatum was felt almost immediately. This was not a distant diplomatic quarrel. It touched homes, families, and entire communities already living under the strain of war and displacement. Burkina Faso is a nation of resilience, but also of deep wounds. More than 2 million people have been displaced by jihadist violence. Over 7,000 lives were lost in a single year, far more than before Traoré took power. Yet in this storm, something unexpected happened. The ultimatum lit a spark of national unity. Citizens long divided by fear and distrust now rallied behind their leader. Even opposition voices, once quick to condemn military rule, fell silent. They knew that to attack Traoré in this moment would be seen as an attack on the nation's dignity itself. A recent Afrobarometer survey revealed the depth of this shift. 66% of Burkinabe now accept military rule, compared to just 24% in 2012. The change was not simply about military strength. It was about a man who dared to say aloud what others had only whispered, that Africa deserves respect. The effects rippled beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal, student unions issued joint declarations, urging the African Union to stand firmly with Traoré. They even proposed diplomatic penalties against nations that dismissed Africa's sovereignty. In South Africa, Namibia, and Tanzania, lawmakers began calling for a review of trade ties with Israel if no apology came. These moves were rare, bold, and revealed something powerful. The ultimatum was shifting from symbol to substance. Meanwhile, international financial institutions raised alarms. They warned that such a confrontational stance could scare away investors or invite Western sanctions. European and American envoys sought private meetings with Traoré's advisors, eager to know if this was a speech for the cameras or the beginning of a new African doctrine. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, in villages scarred by conflict, people were less concerned with investors. What mattered was that the world had been forced to hear them. For the first time, ordinary Burkinabe felt seen. In camps of the displaced, children repeated Traoré's words like a fable. In villages lit only by fire, elders told the story of the ultimatum as if it were the first page of a new chapter in Africa's destiny. To them, dignity had finally been spoken aloud. And yet, beneath this pride lay danger. Analysts warned that expectations were rising too quickly. If the 48 hours ended with silence, the flame of hope could turn to ash. High hopes, unmet, can cut deeper than silence. The risk was clear. One leader's bold words could unite a continent, or leave it fractured if the promise faded. So the question grew heavier with every passing hour. Would this ultimatum be remembered as a turning point for African sovereignty? Or would it dissolve into disappointment, a story retold not with pride, but with regret? When you think about this, Do not rush. Ask yourself what dignity means to a people who have waited centuries for it. If this story touches you, reflect on it. And if you feel moved, leave your thoughts in the comments. Your words can carry weight. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories that go beyond headlines and touch the heart of history, consider subscribing. Not for the sake of numbers, but to stand with a community that values truth, justice, and the dignity of every nation. In Washington, the ultimatum struck like thunder. The United States, long used to quiet diplomacy from Africa, suddenly faced a leader who refused to whisper. Inside the State Department, some officials dismissed Traore as reckless, warning that such bold defiance could fracture fragile alliances and complicate American strategy in the Sahel. Yet others, especially younger African American scholars and activists, saw something else. To them, this was not recklessness. It was clarity. It was sovereignty spoken without apology. It was a moment when Africa claimed its place at the table of history. Across American universities, debates erupted. At Howard University, lecture halls stayed full late into the night as students dissected the meaning of Traore's words. At UCLA, student forums praised the ultimatum as a lesson in courage. They were not discussing policies on paper. They were celebrating the courage to stand tall. In Moscow, state media hailed Traore as a hero of the global South. In Beijing, commentators spoke of Burkina Faso's defiance as part of a wider realignment of global power. Both Russia and China saw opportunity in Africa's new voice. Meanwhile, in Brussels and Para, leaders chose cautious words, speaking of dialogue while hiding unease. They knew the balance of power in Africa was shifting faster than they could manage. Even in the Middle East, the reactions were split. Some governments criticized Traore for provoking unnecessary tension. Others, quietly, admired the boldness of a small African nation forcing Israel onto the defensive. What united these perspectives was a single truth. The ultimatum had changed the conversation. It was no longer about whether Israel would apologize. It was about Africa demanding respect, openly, unapologetically, and on its own terms. And so the question now extended beyond Africa. Could this moment mark the beginning of a wider crisis? Would it redraw alliances, reshape economies, and unsettle the fragile order of the world? Or would it fade, like so many sparks before, into silence? Sometimes, history is not written by the strongest armies or the richest nations, but by one voice that dares to speak when all others remain quiet. As the final hours of the ultimatum passed, no apology came from Prime Minister Netanyahu. On the surface, it seemed the challenge had failed. But the truth was different. Ibrahim Traoré and Burkina Faso had already forced the world to listen. For one moment in time, Africa was not a silent observer. It was the center of a global conversation about dignity and sovereignty. Yet pride carried with it a shadow of danger. A young leader who dared to defy the established order would not walk an easy road. Sanctions, isolation, even threats to his life were possibilities waiting ahead. If he endured, Africa might step into a new chapter of independence. If he fell, a generation could be left disillusioned, convinced that courage brings only suffering. This is the burden of history. One man standing on a stage can become the spark that lights a continent, or the flame that burns out too quickly. And so the question remains, one that only time will answer. Ibrahim Traoré, hero of Africa's dignity, or reckless voice risking its future? Think carefully about what this means. For a continent that has endured centuries of dismissal, dignity is not a word. It is survival. It is the inheritance of every child who deserves to walk tall. If this story has moved you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Do you see Traoré as a symbol of hope, or as a dangerous gamble? And if you want to continue following stories that matter, stories that reveal the struggles and the courage of nations often ignored, then subscribe to this channel. Not to follow empty headlines, but to join a community that values truth, justice, and the dignity of every people. Together, we will watch history as it is written, and refuse to let the voices of Africa be silenced.